2.
Hello and welcome to our Public Access Forum number 2. My name is Rod Gillette. With me tonight are Sue Buskey on my left, representing the Buskey Group, a consulting firm working with the city on its cable television franchise renewal process. On my immediate right, Joe Sapp, a fellow member of the city's cable task force, and Christine Gardner, Columbia Access Television's board president. We're recording this discussion shortly after the Buskey Group had announced the results of the needs assessment. It's been gathering information for this assessment over the past year. Sue, let's start with you. First of all, let's define a couple of terms here. What do you mean by needs assessment?
It's a fancy word for public input, okay? In short, it's using a variety of ways of gathering information. It's trying to get thoughts from the public, both about what they think about, in this case, their cable service now, but also what their vision is for the future and how that vision ties into key needs and interests of the community.
Let's talk a little bit Let's talk briefly about the tools that you use to conduct this assessment, and then we'll get into some of the results.
Well, we did a number of things. We conducted a statistically valid telephone survey. We did a series of focus group meetings, and at the focus group meetings we distributed a questionnaire as well as did a brainstorming process. We gathered and examined strategic planning documents from just a whole array of organizations and institutions and so forth. We did some interviews with representatives, particularly of the three academic institutions, post-secondary academic institutions. We did on-site inspections and discussions with the staff for the Government Access Channel and the Education Access Channel and for CAT. And then there was a public hearing. And all of that information got pulled together into a draft report. Roughly
speaking, how many people do you think have had some comment, some input into this?
Well, I'm just figuring in my mind with the phone survey, the participants of the focus groups, the public hearing, and then the strategic planning documents represent organizations that serve a very, like the Columbia Public Schools, Boone County Public Library. So those agencies, big brothers and sisters, serve a lot of people. So indirectly, thousands, okay? Directly, probably in the vicinity of probably 700 to 800.
But enough that you think you have a fairly good idea of what Columbia cable television viewers think about cable television and about the idea of public access.
Very definitely, and the reason for that is because we used a variety of research tools. Okay, there's certain kinds of information you can get from a telephone survey. Yeah. There's different kinds of information you can get from focus groups. Okay, you gather yet different information from examining strategic planning documents. And by using all these various modes of information gathering, what you begin to see is nexus information lining up from different sources, but stacking up along certain lines, which tells us this is a trend, this is a key finding. And so we feel very good. I mean, in most communities, the process we've been through here, which has taken about a year, would have taken a year and a half or to a year and 3/4. So there's been a tremendous outpouring of interest and just a lot of really good information.
I know that the information you've gathered has filled many, many pages. Would you, I hate to have you leave out a lot of stuff, but you're going to have to in our time problem here. But essentially, what would you consider to be the main findings of this needs assessment?
Well, there's probably about 6 of them, okay? The first one is that having access to communication systems, services, and information technology is really deemed as a key element in Columbia for future community and economic development. And that's one of those things, you just see it popping up all over as far as how the information ties. And it makes a lot of sense given the nature of this community, given the importance of communications technologies to education, to business, to just quality of life, etc. It's a key element. Another key finding is that enhancing local media resources is seen as a very, very specific strategy in helping address some key concerns and problems in the community. The ability for people to talk to each other, to share, to talk through different issues, to share information with a larger community, that deemed as really an important thing. Another key finding is that there's an extremely high level of interest in having public education and government access channels, okay, on the cable system for use by all kinds of community groups and organizations and residents and schools and kids and seniors and government agencies. So that's another one. So having the channels is important to be able to get local information. And then a logical follow-up, which was another key finding, is that there is also a great deal of interest in making sure there's a community media center that is available that provides the tools of the media and some basic training in the tools of the media to people in the community who don't have access to those sorts of things. They may be content experts about whatever their subject is, okay, the key group they're working with or key concern they have, but they may not know how to use the tools of the media. So having the media center there is deemed as a very, very important thing that's needed. And following that, we looked at what is in place already. We needed to figure out whether what's in place is being used as far as resources. And what we found is that the current resources available for public education and government access are inadequate to meet the current needs, let alone the future needs. And that's a fairly, again, just given what we see, the huge amount of interest, and given how much everything is being used that is here, okay, and in some cases, how small amount of resources that are here, that was another key finding. Some other things that were not directly access related, a little bit more specific, there seems to be a real need for the city to look at some cable customer service issues. Specifically, we saw some concerns in the telephone answering and also the ability for people to schedule a technician to come at their time to their home during various hours of the day and 4-hour windows and these sorts of things. There are, those are a few of the key things that I really haven't touched at all on the past performance issues, which are sort of another category.
And those, of course, are issues that are going to be dealt with or considered and discussed as you and the city councilor and the city council and the city staff get into the nitty-gritty of actually negotiating new franchise agreements. I guess one of the things we should probably mention is that our existing franchises with the 2 cable companies that serve Columbia area will expire at sometime in January, if I recall. And so you'll get into all of this. And what we're talking about so far really only has to do with one segment of this whole negotiating process. That is the public access television, which now is, of course, CAT Channel 3, which you're watching. You're just beginning these negotiations. You've got a franchise that's going to expire in January, 2 franchises. What's going to, I would say it's almost a near certainty you won't complete negotiations by the time that these expire. So then what happens?
Basically, the current franchises the plan is that the council will extend those current franchises for about a year to allow the city to properly complete the franchise renewal process and make sure that we have a reasonable amount of time to get the job done and to do the quality job that I think people expect.
Joe Sapp, you're, as we said, a member of the Cable Task Force. What are your thoughts about the recommendations that the task force has made and is likely to make, if you can make any prediction or speculation, in regard to the new franchise and adequate funding for the, we haven't even talked about the funding problem yet, for the, what we call the PEG channels?
When I came on the task force after it had been established, but when it was set up, one of its charges was to help make this channel happen. And I think the task force has done a very good job of that. They've been very supportive in getting CAT 3 off the ground. So that's one of the components of their mission was this. We have a 3-legged stool. We've got PEG. Well, we were missing one of the legs, so this is that leg.
Quick definition, public access is the P, E is educational, G is government.
Right, and the public access component was missing. So we feel very good about getting that off the ground, but right now public access is on its spending its last dollar even as we speak. They have received some startup funding, but it has not been enough to keep the station going as much as it will need to have if it's going to be viable over the long haul. So the task force has consistently recommended that the city find ways to assure that funding stream for the public access component. And we've suggested some ways that they might accomplish that, but ultimately that will be part of the negotiation. Whatever the city and Mediacom and Charter can agree to will be the source that we will use.
Well, to get to the bottom line, the task force has recommended in the past that the franchise fee be increased. Is now 3%, which is about as lower than just about any other community in the state of Missouri or in much of the country for that matter. And it doesn't look like this is going to happen as an independent move anyway. A funding or a franchise fee increase might be made part of the negotiating process on franchise renewal, if I understand it.
Well, it could be, but there's really been some confusion circulating, and one of the things I've been trying to do lately is to get to sort of straighten out the wires, so to speak.
Please do.
As franchise fee, okay. The reason there's a franchise between the city and the cable operator is because the cable operator is using the public's property to run their cable system, to put their wires on the poles, or the utilities are underground, to put them in the conduit. The company, Mediacom, for instance, over the term of a 10-year franchise, the new 10-year franchise will probably generate roughly $350 to $400 million just from the city of Columbia.
And to put this in context, to run this station will cost significantly less than that over the course of that time. It's really a very small amount of money we're talking about.
So the franchise fee is essentially rent that comes back to the community for the use of the right-of-way, and it comes in two forms. The franchise fee is one form of the rent. Another form of the rent is the funding for access, for public education and government access. They're two separate things, okay? And it's really important to recognize that even if the city chooses not to raise the franchise fee from 3% to 5%, they have every ability, particularly given the findings in the needs assessment, to negotiate independent funding separate from the franchise fee to support public education and government access. And there's been some confusion kind of circulating that for some reason the only way that there could be funding for PEG is if the franchise fee went from 3% to 5%. That's really and we really need to correct that assumption, because it's an incorrect assumption. There are two forms the rent comes in back to the community. One is the franchise fee. One is the ability for the city to negotiate for resources to support public education, government access, totally separate from the franchise fee.
And so this is really a normal part of doing business. To pay for these things, it's not as though this is something that is optional. This is something that they are currently contractually obligated to do. And there's no reason not to include that in any contract that we negotiate from this point out.
Your survey of the general public on that particular topic of franchise fee increase, only about 28%, if I recall, of the respondents said they would favor a franchise fee increase if it were devoted solely to financing public access television. Am I correct in that finding or no?
There were 28.2% that said yes, they would support the concept of the franchise fee being goes to 3% to 5% if that money were used to support Access TV. Another roughly 12.8% said they didn't have an opinion right now. And then the balance said no. The dilemma we've got here is that that question has to do with the franchise fee. It does not have anything to do with funding, independent funding for PEG access. Two totally separate issues. You have to look at how the question was worded. We were asked by the city to word the question in a particular way. That's how we worded it, okay? But it's real important that people understand that just because folks don't want the franchise fee to go to 3 to 5%, and a portion of that money to be used to support access, doesn't mean that those people are saying they don't want access and they don't want to have the cable company support access.
And
two separate things.
And Claire, for me, if it was raised from 3 to 5%, that does not necessarily mean that the cable bills that people receive are going to necessarily be raised that amount. It's a decision of Mediacom or Charter to do that.
That's exactly correct. Yeah, and that's another thing. Congress, unfortunately, on this issue didn't do us any favors, okay? Because what they did back with the '84 Act was they basically said, okay, local governments, in '84, local governments only could collect 3%. And if they wanted to go to 5%, they had to use that extra 2% for PEG, okay? And for local programming. Well, what happened in '84 when the Cable Act was passed was Congress said, okay, local governments, you could unilaterally, automatically collect 5% if you want to, but that's the ceiling on the franchise fee part of the rent, okay? But cable companies, since we're allowing the cities to unilaterally collect up to 5%, cable companies, we're going to let you show that as a line item on the bill, which is rather misleading to the public because people see that line item on the bill and they think it's a tax or a fee on the subscriber. It is not. It is a fee that the cable operator is paying. The cable operator just happens to be able to show it as a line item on the bill. Now, in most cases, when people look at their bills, like their phone bill, they're used to seeing X amount for that tax or the TTY for hearing impaired or whatever. They see those as taxes or fees on the subscriber. That is not what the franchise fee is. It is a fee, it is a rent payment by the cable operator for the use of the right-of-way. So this line iteming thing really has blurred this issue tremendously for the public.
And so it would be like if a business had their rent for their building raised, do they pass that on to the customer or not? It's their decision, right?
But do they put it on your receipt? I mean,
Right, exactly. That's our dilemma.
But the media companies have said time and time again in our task force meetings, you raise the franchise fee, we raise what we charge our subscribers.
But they raise what they charge the subscribers anyway.
Well, but that's, I think that is what the public is how the public is associating that, and so they see this question, would you favor a franchise fee increase, and only 28% say yes.
Well, although, didn't you say that in your surveying that we had stronger support for public access and education and government in this community than in you only had 2 others that rated higher, is that right?
Yeah, we've been doing this research for a long time, and so with regard to some of the questions that are on the telephone survey and some of the questions that are on the focus group questionnaire, and I'm going to go to the questionnaires or the telephone survey. The exact same questions have been asked in literally hundreds of communities in exactly the same way, using exactly the same methodology. And so it allows us to do some comparisons on the questions that were handled, and my research partner is a precise person about these sorts of things, as he well should be, okay? And what I did before I came was I looked at a summary on the question of how important it is for you to have channels available for use by local government, schools, community organizations, for community events, et cetera. And it's one of the questions in the phone survey that's been asked exactly the same way for a number of years. And of all the places that we have data on, there were only 2 places that ever had a higher ranking of very important or importance in Columbia, okay? And that ranking in the phone survey was 80.1%, said it was either very important or important. Now, to me, that is a significant piece of information because it shows that people here are interested in and think it is important that there is channels set aside for these purposes.
Christine Gardner, president of the, how do we call it, the CAT Advisory Board or the
Board of Directors.
Board of Directors, beg your pardon. what do you see as happening to this channel over the next few months if we're still, in effect, out there begging for money?
It's going to be grim.
Are you going to go dark?
Well, I would hope not, but we have really stretched our volunteer resources and our financial resources about as much as they can go. And, you know, we've got so much momentum built up. It would be really a crime to sort of pull the rug underneath us from now. And
Didn't you have an event over the weekend?
oh, we had 2 events over the weekend. It was so incredible. You know, I'm fairly new to cable access television. I'm kind of a newbie to this, but so I'm sort of learning what's involved and what the interest is. So we had an open house on Friday night, which it was phenomenal. We had standing room only people here waiting to find out how they could get involved, what they could do, how they can plug in, and plus we pulled out of the hat for our one-night stand event the next night, a film genre and an item, an object. And we had 20 crews of people ready to spend the next 24 hours making a 3-minute film using the science fiction was the genre and signs as the object. So probably multiply 20 times 4 or 5 people were spending their whole 24-hour, and they didn't sleep, they just made these 3-minute films. And the next night we had the grand showing, once again, standing room only. I was really blown away by the excitement in the room when we pulled the items and the genre out of the hat, and they were like, oh, we're ready to go. And then the next night they were there and they had their 3-minute films, and they had devoted all this time and energy to it. And it was a really great event, and it went towards paying, unfortunately, our equipment repair bills, which we're trying to keep our equipment going because it's heavily used, and anything that's heavily used is subject to, you know, repair. And so that was what the money was raised for.
But this is also going to have a nice side benefit because we're going to get to show the films.
Oh yeah,
on the
keep watching
station.
Cat because it'll be on.
Yeah.
Well, I hope I get some promotion out there so people know when to look. We're talking about we've been focusing here, concentrating on the community access television with some references now and then to the governmental access channel and the educational access channel. But the negotiating process, as we mentioned a few moments ago, also covers a whole range of topics having to do with the television, the cable television service that we get in our homes and offices. Your studies have included technical studies, where you're testing the signal strength and the reception and the quality of the picture and the quality of the sound. It's included some operational problems, as you've found. A lot of people have complained they don't get the phone answered in time, or they're put on hold a long time. You also conducted an audit. We haven't even talked about the audit. Anything you want to say about the audit at this point?
Well, what we found was that both companies had underpaid franchise fees. In the case of both Mediacom and Charter, they've acknowledged that they've underpaid a certain amount, but then there's a certain amount that's in dispute. And the in dispute parts basically boil down to not a method of computation or whatever, but rather there's a definition of gross revenues. And that definition of gross revenues that is in the ordinance is then it's sort of like the revenue for those things go into a basket, so to speak, and then you figure the 3%. Okay, well, there's a dispute between the city and the cable operators about what items go in the basket, so to speak, that you figure the 3% of. That will get worked out as part of the negotiating process. In fact, all of the areas where we've identified non-compliance with the current cable television regulatory ordinance, that's part of the negotiating process, is to reach settlement around those issues.
Sue, one thing I want to clarify. Now, the money that comes to us, comes to our community from these fees, that stays in our community. What does the rest of Mediacom and Charter's money, where does that go?
Well, it goes to corporate or to whatever, okay.
So I think that's an important point to some
Yeah.
people, is
And-
this is money that will stay here in our community.
That and there's another value that's not part of this discussion, which is that we rent them the space for their lines, and they pay a fee for that, but there's a value over and above what they do for cable television to those lines. Having that right-of-way is worth a whole lot of money that isn't included in the franchise fee.
Well, it is, and it's interesting. Having worked in this field a long time, I can remember a story that was told to me by a gentleman who has now passed away, but he was an old-time cable operator, and he had been in the cable in very early days in the 40s, late 40s and early 50s. And it used to be that the cable companies had to go and negotiate private easement rights from all the landholders, and because they didn't go and get the rights to use the public streets and rights of way. They didn't have that right. And he said he told me stories about going to and meeting him in the front yard with a shotgun saying, "Get off my property." Okay. So back in the early days, when finally there was the ability to use the easements and the right-of-ways to put the wires on, the old-time cable operators recognized it was a very extremely valuable asset to them because they didn't have to go out and negotiate private easement rights. That's all being taken for granted now. And I think, Joe, your point is, I think, very well taken, that easement is a limited public asset. And there's only so much space on it, okay? And the cable operator is being given the ability to use that limited public asset. So it really is something that needs to come back. Something needs to come back to the community in exchange for access to the easement. I mean, if they're successful financially, that's great.
Yeah.
All right. But something, there needs to be resources that come back to the community in exchange.
You're in the process of, well, I don't know where you are actually in this process of negotiating. At what point do you really begin the formal negotiations? You, as a consultant, as an advisor, I guess would be your capacity here, a resource person. Cable companies on one side of the table, city staff on the other side. Where are we in starting that process right now? And this is December,
Yeah.
early December.
We had, in early December 2005, we had our first negotiating session, both with Mediacom and with Charter. And we laid out some negotiating ground rules, and we're proceeding to start to work through some of the key areas in the franchise. So we are moving forward.
And what happens if you can't, I know this is not going to happen, but if you cannot reach agreement, then what's the next step?
Well, basically, if the parties, I mean, one of the things that I recommend to my clients is that we say right up front, we're going to negotiate for 5 days or 6 days or 3 days, whatever it is, okay? And then, as a city, we're going to assess our progress. And if we have made reasonable amount of progress on some of the key issues, and I'm not talking about wordsmithing and crossing the T's and dotting the I's, but really on the key issues, okay? Then the city can make a decision to proceed with more negotiation sessions. If it seems like there is just no progress or not reasonable progress being made, then the city kicks into what's called the formal procedures under Act, and that's what you're asking about. And that is to prepare and issue what's called an RFRP, a request for renewal proposal. That will cause the cable operators to have to respond to a very formalized, structured RFP type document. Usually it's in a binder, it's probably 100 to 150 pages long. There's very specific things they have to respond to. And then that kicks in, what the company then submits a response, the city evaluates it, makes a preliminary decision based on certain factors dictated by federal law as to whether to grant or renew the proposal based on responses to the RFP, and then the process rolls out from there. But that's the next step if we can't reach agreement informally, which I suspect that the parties will be able to. But sometimes cities do have to proceed down and begin to prepare and maybe even issue the RFP with a full willingness to continue to negotiate informally. So you're trying to reach agreement through two processes at that point, not just one.
Yeah, it's to everyone's advantage. We've got the cable is in place. We've got the system ready to go. It's to everyone's advantage to make this work. To have to go back and start from scratch, I think, would be incredibly difficult and expensive for everyone.
Is there a typical time period when this normally finally comes to a conclusion?
You know, the negotiating process in part itself pretty typically takes at least a year, and I've seen it take up to 2.5. And then then you add on how much time, the time it takes to get ready for the negotiation, which is the needs assessment and the performance review and so forth. Federal law actually calls out that this should be at least a 36-month process. So it's not a process that's intended to be short. And frankly,
Because the franchise itself will be, what, 10 years typically?
in today's world, we typically see them something in the vicinity of 10. It used to be they were 15 and 20. Although, frankly, with all the goings on in Washington, D.C., with regard to potential changes in the law, we're seeing the cable operators just generally nationwide now, where they used to say they wanted the longest franchise they could get. Now they're starting to say they want a short one because they want to hedge their bets on what's going to happen with Congress.
So what happens, CAT had initial startup money, and we've spent that. It's gone, or virtually gone. If this process extends out another year or even 2 years, what happens to the station?
Well, given the level of support and what people here have been able to do in this community with very limited resources, a couple of things crossed my mind. The first and probably the most important thing is that right now both companies are obligated to have a studio. They're obligated to have equipment for that studio. They're obligated to have personnel to help support public access programming. All of these things are areas of non-compliance with the current franchise agreement. Okay, I think it's important to recognize that will be an ongoing issue, but the companies have an obligation. Now, with that being said, how do we bridge the gap between where today and when the new franchise is granted? And there are probably a couple of ways to do it. The city could say, listen, we already know, for instance, that the companies in writing have agreed that they, and the not franchise fee underpayment part, that they're obligated to about, between the two companies, about $34,000–$35,000. So maybe knowing we have a piece of paper in writing that says they're acknowledging that, maybe if the companies won't give it to us now, we can forward that money, knowing we're going to get it back. Okay. I think as I've looked at some of the research that we've done, there was a commitment of X amount of dollars by Mediacom at one point about 18 months ago, something like that, or maybe a little longer. But I'm not sure all the money that was committed to actually came to CAT. I mean, when we started to do research, it was one of the things we couldn't quite figure out. I think the city needs to look at that piece to find out whatever that gap is, 25,000, 30,000, whatever it is. So you add that to potentially sort of fronting that money that the city knows they're going to get back, and you begin to create at least a nest egg to help get CAT through, because it would just be a horrible shame to have all the energy and and volunteerism that people have put forward to get things to this point sort of dropped because of a relatively small amount of money for which the company is actually obligated to provide support and has been since the franchises were granted, and they haven't done it.
Well, you make that point, I think, very very succinctly, very clearly in your report. The charter, nor its predecessors, never has provided any studio or equipment. Mediacom has not provided any, or its predecessors has not provided equipment or studio, at least since what, sometime in the 80s.
That's correct.
But then you turn around and say, well, gee, they gave $130,000 to get us started here. Does that equate to providing the facilities then?
No, because the city never took a position. Council never acted. The city never said that fulfills your obligation. Okay.
And the city would have to say
this. The city
this.
would have to say that fulfilled their obligation before it fulfilled their obligation. And in my research, the city purposely did not say it fulfilled their obligation, because they felt as they entered the renewal process, they did not want to make statements of that nature that would potentially compromise what the findings of anything when the research was really done around noncompliance and needs, community needs and interests.
I've got to ask this, and I probably kick myself for asking it, but did we start this station too prematurely? Should we have waited for all of this to?
No, I think actually it was exactly the right thing to do, at least from my perspective, because there was some educating that was being done in the community and some excitement being generated, totally independent of this renewal process. Before the renewal process and any research was done, okay, we can really say from a very pure research perspective that it isn't anything that, any idea that we the consultants brought to town that stimulated the interest. It was already here. People had already taken action to move forward because they thought it was something important. And that's on the P part. The E and the G, the K through 12, E and the G have been here forever.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the most exciting things about what we've been talking about recently is this community media center where all of these functions can come together and then some. We can do a lot of other things. And I would really like to see that happen. I'd love to see Columbia have something like that.
That's actually one of the things when just in looking at all the data that was gathered, is that there was a real sense of a desire for people to work together and collaborate. Okay, and to take whatever resources can come out the other end of this renewal process, and rather than P or E or G saying, this is my little piece, I'm going to leave and I'm not going to share it with anybody, okay, is to say, well, gee, if I need a half a glass and you only need a half a glass, all right, maybe we can get a whole glass rather than 2/3, all right? And by collaborating and working together and leveraging resources, we can not only take what might come out of this renewal process, but we can use that to leverage grants and other things. But you have to have enough resources at the beginning, at the ground floor, to get things going correctly, have it equipped correctly and staffed at the most basic level that you need to have the foundation from which to leverage other grants and other opportunities that might be out there in the community.
A community media center and the kind of collaboration that Joe is talking about would be an ideal goal, but it would not be part of the franchise necessarily, would it?
Yeah.
It would be part.
Absolutely. See, what folks used to call PEG access centers or access centers, Community Media and Technology Center is just a new name for it. Why is it called that? Because with the convergence of technologies that are used for computers and for video, it's all converged. So the concept here is this Community Media Center really serves an umbrella. It's like a big tent. Okay, it's like kind of a combination of a library, a learning environment, and a community center. Okay, all kind of under one roof, which allows, for instance, in this case, the three post-secondary, the college and the two colleges and the universities. Well, they each want to do things, but the idea of trying to get them to work together, somebody needs to facilitate that process. That is the role of the entity that runs the Community Media Center. They are a resource facilitator. They check the equipment out like you check a book out of the library. They provide training. And so that Community Media Center really is the resource center that will be run by, in this case, as we see it based on public input, Columbia Access Television.
Yeah, we have Columbia belongs to a regional library system, and the virtue of that is that all of those kind of administrative functions are take place here at our Columbia Public Library, but they serve the branches and they serve the other libraries. The other libraries maintain their autonomy, their independence, but they don't have to hire a cataloger and duplicate the effort of the other libraries in the system, and I think that's what's going on here. If you put all of these together, you'll put all of those administrative functions in one place, but all of these other groups will maintain their autonomy. They'll still be what they are. They will still have their identity.
And control their content.
Right.
And that's exactly the vision for the community media. And there's actually a lot of them around the country now. Grand Rapids, Michigan is an example, a Midwestern example of one of the really early, they started the Community Media Center. They had an access channel for years, for over 20-some years. I actually helped start it a long time ago in the fallout shelter of the main library in Grand Rapids in downtown. That's where the first access center was in GR, okay?
Next to the boxes of crackers and the water.
Well, it's interesting because the gentleman who was the executive director, Dirk was about 6'10", and in order to go in and out the doors, he was always ducking his head. And about 1992, he really had this vision of a community media and technology center. And what they did was they moved from the concept, the old sort of access TV concept, to the concept of community media and technology. And he was just a little ahead of his time only because, but he could see the convergence, the technology convergence stuff going on. And so now they're bubbling up all over the country. There's a lot of them.
And I can see that being a real economic development thing too. I mean, at the library, the computers are constantly being used by people who are gaining job skills, who are applying for jobs, running small businesses out of the library. And what that does is it levels the playing field for people who cannot afford to have their home computer and their internet access. They're on equal footing with every other applicant when they go online at the library.
There are all kinds of opportunities available in this to average folks out there. We probably ought to wind this up, but in doing so, what do we need to do next? What do you need to do next? What does the average citizen need to do next?
Well, what we'll be doing next is proceeding through the negotiating process, and it's so much fun. I think for the community, folks need to keep their eye on the ball, okay? How they can use technology to meet community needs. And they need to you need to keep going in that direction. And I think part of what, and a real important thing, is to become more knowledgeable about what's happening other places, what's worked, okay? And that's one of the things I found is as people learn more about, I mean, they may know a lot about the subject content that's their job or their expertise, and they just haven't thought a lot about how they could use the tools of the media to help, if they were available to them, to help do what they do better on a daily basis. So I think also it's making sure that everyone is sharing those visions with their city councilmen, with their school board members, with city staff, that there's really a continual networking going on around this, because I think it creates a win-win. And you just have a fabulous set of data here that comes from the public. That creates a very strong case.
So you mentioned Grand Rapids. Could you give people a couple of other examples? They could go to the website, maybe look at some other communities to see what they're doing.
Grand Rapids is a good Midwest example. Another on West Coast, two places strike me as really good examples: Santa Rosa, California, which is actually a community kind of similar in size to Columbia, and Monterey, California, which is substantially smaller. But they are really doing cutting-edge technology things in Monterey. And they have a fascinating collaboration between 7 post-secondary academic institutions: military, Defense Language Institute, Naval Postgraduate School, so and the Monterey Bay Aquarium.
So there's probably also an educational mission here.
Yeah.
For all of us. And well, as Sue said, if you feel strongly about this in one way or the other, you should contact your city council person and or the mayor and share your thoughts. And I'm sure that in the coming year or more of your negotiations and your return to Columbia from time to, you gotta get a permanent apartment, that we'll probably be gathering again one of these days to have a public access forum number 3. Until then, thanks to Sue Buskey, to Christine Gardner, and to Joe Sapp, my name is Rod Gillette.